Welcome to the Explainer, students. Listen, if you're gearing up for that big midterm on American religious history, you are in exactly the right place. Today, we're putting together a totally immersive crash course for you. We're going to trace the massive, centuries-long footprint of Christianity in the United States, literally connecting the dots from those very first colonial settlements all the way to modern Supreme Court rulings. So, let's dive right into this.
Here is our roadmap for the review today. First, colonial roots and settlements. 2. The Great Awakenings. 3. Civic and legal traditions. 4. The evolution of ceremonial deism. And 5. The modern era and demographics. Let's get into it.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, Colonial Roots and Settlements.
Looking at this timeline of early settlements, it becomes pretty clear that it wasn't just one monolithic group dropping anchor over here. It was a massive wave of completely different denominations setting up their own distinct geographic strongholds. Way back in 1565, you had Spanish Catholics establishing the very first parish in St. Augustine, Florida. By 1607, English Anglicans settled down in Virginia. Then, the Pilgrims arrived in Massachusetts in 1620, looking for a refuge from non-Anglican persecution. By 1634, Lord Baltimore established Maryland as a haven specifically for Catholics, and eventually in 1683, German immigrants began pouring into Pennsylvania. These geographic origins established incredibly deep denominational roots that, honestly, still echo today.
You're definitely going to want to jot some notes down here because this is a perfect regional study cheat sheet for your exam. You really need to be able to match specific Christian denominations to their regional hubs. So the Puritans dominated New England, hoping to build this deeply religious, tight-knit culture. Pennsylvania, which was owned by William Penn, became a super famous haven for Quakers fleeing persecution. And Maryland, like we just talked about, was initially set up as a proprietary colony where Catholics could actually find some tolerance.
Moving right along to Section 2, the Great Awakenings.
Okay, so if an essay question pops up comparing the two movements, here is exactly how you break it down. The First Great Awakening, happening in the 1730s and 40s, was deeply, deeply theological. It was driven by intense preachers like Jonathan Edwards, and it really sought to return to strict Calvinist roots by reviving the spirituality of congregations that were already established. Now, the Second Great Awakening, which really hit its stride from the 1790s through the 1840s, was an entirely different beast. It focused heavily on the unchurched. It used these massive, highly emotional outdoor camp meetings, and it actually sparked a huge wave of social reform movements.
And here's the crucial so what factor. These awakenings didn't just change people's personal beliefs, they literally rewired the nation. They sparked this explosive growth of Baptist and Methodist congregations. They led directly to the founding of major educational institutions like Princeton University, which was initially created by supporters of the revivals. And critically, they mobilized the African American Christian community. Being totally discontented with racial discrimination in white congregations, forceful black leaders broke away. Richard Allen, for instance, helped form what would become the African Methodist Episcopal, or AME, Church back in 1815.
All right, let's pivot to Section 3, Civic and Legal Traditions.
Now, what's really fascinating about this historical context is a phrase we hear literally all the time, Thomas Jefferson's famous wall of separation between church and state. Well, actually, scratch that. He didn't write it in the Constitution at all. He actually wrote it in an 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptists. And why did he do that? To reassure a Baptist minority in Connecticut who were super frustrated that they had to pay state fees just to support the Congregationalist majority. Jefferson was framing religious expression as a fundamental human right, not just a matter of government permission.
But wait, despite Jefferson's wall, you absolutely must understand this massive paradox in American life. Christian-affiliated phrasing remains deeply, deeply intertwined within our modern government institutions. I mean, we have "In God We Trust" right on our currency. We recite "Under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. Government officials routinely swear their oaths of office on a Bible, and Congress regularly opens its sessions with a prayer. So how does a nation with a strict constitutional separation of church and state actually justify all this?
Which brings us right to Section 4, the evolution of ceremonial deism.
Here is a massive takeaway for the constitutional law segment of your exam: ceremonial deism. Think of this as the legal shield used to classify embedded religious symbols as harmless cultural history. The core argument here is that when a religious phrase becomes so incredibly embedded in public life over a long period of time, it kind of loses its active religious endorsement and simply becomes a cultural artifact.
So how do courts actually apply this stuff? Well, according to legal scholars like former federal judge Michael McConnell, the very first step is to check for coercion. Under this specific view, expressions are considered constitutional if they lack coercion, meaning the government isn't actively forcing a specific belief onto you. If there's no coercion happening and the practice has a really long-standing historical tradition, courts will very often classify it as a cultural practice rather than an unconstitutional establishment of a religion.
We literally see this judicial precedent in action when we look at two landmark cases, Marsh v. Chambers in 1983 and Town of Greece v. Galloway in 2014. In both of these instances, the Supreme Court was asked if legislative prayer violated the Establishment Clause, and in both cases, the court upheld the prayers. They relied heavily on historical tradition, ruling that this was a consistent cultural pattern dating all the way back to the nation's founding, rather than a purely religious endorsement.
Now, looking at both sides neutrally, let's be real, this doctrine is highly controversial. Critics like legal scholar Stephen Epstein argue that ceremonial deism is really just a cover that perpetuates Christian privilege and marginalizes non-adherents. He makes the point that just repeating a religious phrase over and over doesn't magically strip it of its religious meaning. And this debate is very much alive today. For example, when the Trump administration took steps to establish a White House faith office and provided guidance on religious expression, like prayer for federal employees, critics quickly argued that this crossed the line from ceremonial tradition right back into active public endorsement.
Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, Modern Era and Demographics.
Despite what you might hear about the rise of the religiously unaffiliated over the last couple of decades, the 2024 Gallup survey shows that a massive 69% of the U.S. population still identifies as Christian. It overwhelmingly remains the dominant religion in the country.
Slicing that pie up a bit further, Protestantism holds the plurality at 45%, followed by Catholicism at roughly 22%, with groups like the Latter-day Saints sitting at 1.5%. This very specific breakdown actually makes the United States the nation with the largest Protestant population globally.
To put that into absolute terms, that percentage represents roughly 235 million people. This totally cements the United States as having the largest absolute Christian population in the world today. While other countries might have higher percentages of Christians, literally no single nation has more Christians in total raw numbers than the US.
So tying this whole shebang together for your midterm, just remember that these modern demographics and our modern political debates, they don't just exist in a vacuum. They are the direct living result of those early colonial ships landing in Massachusetts and Virginia, the highly emotional revival camps of the Great Awakenings, and the intricate constitutional arguments taking place right now in our highest courtrooms.
I'm going to leave you with this one final essay prompt to chew on before you sit down for your exam. Based on the historical and legal evidence we've covered in this explainer, does the legal concept of ceremonial deism effectively protect religious freedom by allowing historical traditions to breathe? Or does it dilute the separation of church and state, marginalizing those who just don't share the majority faith? Think on that one. Good luck on the test, students, and keep asking the big questions.